Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my April wrap-up. I read 22 books in April because I have no life and I was just in a weird mood, so I'm just gonna get straight into them because this is gonna be kind of a long video. As always, you can find links to all the booktubers I mentioned and a list of all the books that I've mentioned down below in the description box. The first book that I read in April was All the Walls of Belfast by Sarah J. Carlson. I was recommended this by Abby from Autumn of Pelennor, and I gave this book 4 stars. This is a young adult contemporary that's set in Ireland, I think 15 years after the Troubles, 14, something along those lines. It's about a teenage girl who's visiting Ireland to see her father for the first time since she was a baby, and while there she falls in love with a boy who is on the other side of the wall because he's Protestant and her father was in the IRA, and the book follows their romance in a kind of Romeo and Juliet fashion. I actually wasn't the biggest fan of the romance in this book, but the culture was written so incredibly well. It was so vivid. The individual characters were so well developed, and I absolutely adored this. Carlson did a really fantastic job of capturing the different cultures because Fiona, the young girl, has grown up in America. So to her, the Troubles and the conflict between the Irish and the Protestants is very theoretical and the kind of thing where she thinks it's over. Whereas to Danny, it's something he's grown up with his whole life and it's very much ingrained in him. And I just thought it was so well done and so interesting. I am American and the author is American, so slight word of caution there, but Abby did say it was realistic, so I will take her word for it. But as a whole, I just thought this was really wonderful. The second book I read in April was Girl in Pieces by Kathleen Glasgow. I gave this 3 stars, and I did like some aspects of it more than others. I had very mixed feelings on this book overall. This is, again, a young adult contemporary. It's about a girl who self-harms, and it's about her process of cutting and also her homelessness and how she's kind of coming to terms with the life she has and putting the pieces back together. I found the writing style kind of poetic and it was very enthralling. This was a book that I read in one sitting. I picked it up and didn't want to put it down until the end, but at the same time it was also a book that fell a little bit on the side of romanticization of self-harm for me, and I can never quite put my finger on why I feel like something romanticizes self-harm. I'm very bad at articulating that, so I really can't at this point in time, although I'm going to try once I film a review for this book. But it did make me uncomfortable, and not in an intentional way where she's writing about self-harm and it makes you uncomfortable because of the subject matter. It was the way she dealt with that subject matter that just very much rubbed me the wrong way. It might have had something to do with the fact that I felt it was very unnecessarily graphic, gratuitously so, and I didn't really enjoy that. But as a whole, I did really like the writing style, and it was an easy read and one of those reads that I was just invested in from start to finish. Then I read The Chaos of Standing Still by Jessica Brody, another YA contemporary, and I gave this one 4 stars. This is about a girl whose best friend has died, and for the past year, she's had an unread text message on her phone from that friend. She's stuck in an airport on New Year's Eve, I believe it is, in a snowstorm, and winds up meeting a guy and kind of going on adventures and talking to the guy. It was a bit generic. I do feel like I've read a great many YA contemporaries that are pretty much exactly like this, but it was fun and it was entertaining and I was invested in the characters. It did fall a little into the trope of girl meets guy who kind of solves all her problems and helps her get over things, but honestly I don't hate that and I thought it was kind of well done in this book, but it was fun, it was interesting, and I did enjoy it. I thought it was worth a read. If you like YA contemporaries like this, you'll probably like this one. I didn't really see much wrong with it, but it wasn't anything super special to me, just a really solid book. And I forgot to mention, The Chaos of Standing Still was recommended to me by Kylie Graham, so links down below as always. Then I took a break from YA contemporaries to read an adult contemporary. I read Beartown by Fredrik, and I gave this book 3 stars. This has been making the rounds on BookTube for quite a while and is very popular, but if you don't know what it's about a very hockey-focused small town in Sweden where a young girl is raped by the star of the hockey team, and essentially it's about the build-up to that and the reactions of the town after. I really wanted to like this book. I really wanted to love Fredrik, and while I really enjoyed the story and the characters, and I thought that was well done, I didn't like his writing style in the slightest. It wasn't something that meshed well with me. I really struggled with the incredibly large cast of characters. It felt like there were too many people for me to wrap my head around, and even at the end, I couldn't really remember who each individual person was, even when they were main characters sometimes. And he also kept pointing out things that were going to happen later, and that was sort of like, not in a spoiler way, just like, stop interrupting the book. Like, I'll get there when I'll get there. Don't tell me something that's going to happen in 10 years, because I don't need that right now. And I didn't mesh well with that. But I did think it was an interesting story, and I do plan on reading the sequel and reading more from him. Just, maybe this wasn't my favorite kind of writing style. But still a solid 3 stars, and I do understand why people love him so much. And then my first nonfiction read was Missoula by Jon Krakauer, which I really loved. This is a book about rape culture. It's about specifically Missoula and some very specific rapes that happened in Missoula and were very publicized. I gave this 5 stars. It was amazing. I went into this book expecting to like it because I do really enjoy Jon Krakauer, but this is my favorite Krakauer book so far. I found it absolutely stunning. It was very hard to read, though, because he is very graphic with the rapes, but he's graphic with a purpose. He's never just describing things for no reason. He's making you realize how impactful these rapes were to the women who experienced them, and I really loved it for that. And I was a bit hesitant about the fact that he was a man writing this book, but he did a fantastic job of being an ally and of telling these women's stories without speaking over them or inserting his voice over theirs. He was sort of just the vehicle for their stories, and I appreciated that so much. If you're interested in learning more about rape culture, if you want to study it at all, especially if you're like a beginner, but even if you're not, if you're looking for like some good introduction, or if you're like a man who doesn't understand it, I think this is a good book because Jon Krakauer was a man who didn't understand the impact of it, and I loved this. I thought it was utterly fantastic, and this is one of the best books I've read so far this year. Then my first audiobook of the month was Believe Me by Ahdieh Izzard. I gave this 3 stars. It's just a memoir of his life, basically. I wanted to like this more than I did because I do really enjoy his stand-up, but honestly, the book was not as good as his stand-up. It didn't really feel like it had much of a purpose. Most memoirs have some sort of purpose or goal within the book itself, like they're trying to do something, they're trying to explain a specific thing. Even if they are rambling and about the whole life, they have a general focal point where everything comes back to, and this book didn't feel like it had any purpose whatsoever. It was just sort of meandering. I felt some parts of it dragged a lot, whereas other parts sounded like him and sounded like his stand-up and were really funny. And I just got bored through part of this book. But I do think if you're a big fan of Ahdieh Izzard, it's probably worth it to read. I'm glad I did listen to it. And I do highly recommend the audiobook over the physical book, because the audiobook is somewhat unedited. Not completely, of course, but he includes various rambles, and like he didn't edit out points where he was checking his phone to like check specific dates or something, which was really funny and very Ahdieh Izzard. So like I'm sure some of that was planned to some extent, but it was just the audiobook is definitely the way to go. I think if you're not the biggest fan of Ahdieh Izzard, probably just listen to more of his stand-up because his stand-up is better. But if you've watched a lot of his stand-up, like you might as well read the book. There was nothing like bad about it. It just wasn't particularly great. Then I finished The Tough Guide to Fantasyland by Diana Wynne Jones, which, thank God, I have never been more relieved to finish a book. I've been reading this literally since November, and not that I put it down and didn't pick it up for months, but I have been consistently reading it since November. It just took me that long. This is a satirical fantasy dictionary, and I decided not to rate it for that reason, because I was very miserable while reading this book, but at the same time, I felt like the content was decent. It's just that it is a satirical fantasy dictionary, and I don't know what about that I thought would be good to read cover to cover, so that was kind of my own fault. But I do think if that's the kind of thing that sounds like it'd be amusing to you, it probably will be, and it's probably much better to just like sit there and like flip through a couple of definitions at a time, like when you're bored and you're just looking for something kind of amusing. Because I did think it was fairly amusing. It was just that I read it cover to cover, and that was kind of a miserable way to experience this book. But I'm not really holding that against this book at all, because it did what it was trying to do, and I can't really fault it for that. It was just not my kind of thing, since I don't really like satire, I don't read all that much fantasy, and it's a dictionary, so this was on me, but I am very glad to have finished it. Then I read Orphan Monster Spy by Matt Killeen. This was also recommended to me by Abby from Autumn of Pelennor, and I gave this book 4 stars. This is a historical fiction novel about a young Jewish girl in Nazi Germany who becomes a spy for a British spy. She winds up going to a boarding school for the elite Nazi youth as an undercover mission. I don't usually like sort of heavy action spy stories, but this was so good. This was incredibly fascinating. Like, I read this in about a day, and it was just one of those books where I was so down for this, and I was so excited when I looked this up and realized there was going to be a sequel at some point eventually, because this is a book that demands a sequel, and I'm not usually someone who's super down for sequels. I mostly prefer standalones, but this book deserved a sequel so much, and I'm so down for the story to continue. The characters were so interesting, and the story was so interesting, and it wasn't too fast or too overdramatic. Well, it was a little bit, which was kind of what kept it down to 4 stars for me. There were just points where it felt like a little bit too much, but just a very little bit. I would highly recommend this book if you like sort of spy things, if you like 1930s Nazi Germany, if you like anything YA historical fiction. This was fantastic. I highly, highly recommend. I just found it fascinating and so much fun. Then I read the final March book in the March trilogy by John Lewis, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell. This is a graphic novel about John Lewis's time being a leader in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It's really interesting. My thoughts on this are exactly the same as the first 2 if you watched last month's wrap-up. I thought it was a really well done book. I thought the story was interesting and important and just incredibly worthwhile. I think it's a good way to learn history, because I do have like a general knowledge of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and I knew who John Lewis was, but this really gives you so much more depth on it that I think is important to know as part of our history, and yeah, I would highly recommend this trilogy. It was super well done. I'm not the biggest fan of graphic novels in general. I do find them kind of visually overstimulating, but really glad I read these, and they were just so worthwhile. And I read the entire Immortals Quartet by Tamora Pierce as part of the rereadathon. These were to fulfill the prompt for books set in a different world, and I really loved my reread of them for the most part. The first is Wild Magic. These are about a young girl who has the magic where she can speak to animals and bond with them on certain other levels as well as the books go along. But she has a magic with animals, and the books follow her and her teacher as they go on adventures and learn more about her magic. The first is an introduction, and not every series works with an introduction book, but I felt like it did really well here. Everything they were introducing was so interesting that it did work for me, and I gave it 5 stars. The second book is Wolf Speaker. They go to a different castle and kind of uncover treasonous events and other things going on, and I gave this 5 stars as well. It wasn't my favorite as a kid, but the plot was just really interesting in this, and I loved the more that we learn about Dane's magic and her connection with animals, and there are a lot more animals in this book. The third is Emperor Mage, my favorite. They go to a different country and sort of deal with the Emperor there, who's been sending raiders and attacking them in a covert way for many years, and they're trying to get peace. This was my favorite back when I was a kid and still is my favorite. I absolutely adore it and gave it 5 stars. The fourth and final book is The Realms of the Gods. This was the one that disappointed me, and I gave it 3 stars. Partially because the story itself kind of takes away from the war. It happens in the Realms of the Gods instead of in Tortau, where the war is going on, which was not the best way to tell the story for me. Some people in their reviews described it more as a travelogue than a war story, and it kind of is, and that got a little bit dull. But mostly I gave this 3 stars because of the romance between the 16-year-old protagonist and the 30-year-old, which I was very uncomfortable with, and I don't know that this would have earned 3 stars if it hadn't been an old favorite of mine, because that really did impact me and my thoughts on this book. Then I listened to Sadie by Courtney Summers. This is the second time I've experienced this book. The first was the physical edition, and now was the audiobook. I gave this 5 stars still. This is a book about a teenage girl whose younger sister has been murdered, and she's on the hunt for the murderer, the man who killed her. And it's also told through a podcast as they're hunting for Sadie, who is now missing. It's just a wonderful book. I absolutely adore it. I will link my full review down below because I already have a review for this. if anyone's interested in my more detailed thoughts, but it's just amazing and I love it, and it's one of my favorites, and I love Courtney Summers. I will say that the audiobook was not actually my favorite. Everyone hyped it up so much that I kind of went in thinking it would change my opinions on audiobooks and make me really love them a lot more than I do, but it kind of didn't, and I do think that when I decide to reread the book, I'll definitely go back to the physical edition. Then I listened to Unstoppable by Bill Nye, which is his book on climate change. I didn't know it was about climate change initially. I figured that out very early though, because it is entirely about climate change and global warming. And once I did, I was kind of hoping that I was going to come away from this book with a better understanding of climate change and like be able to follow the discussion on it. But honestly, I really couldn't. I gave it 3 stars, and I was actually pretty disappointed in this book. I found it very dry and too technical for me as someone who is very scientifically challenged. I couldn't follow a lot of the details of what he said. I came away understanding the general concepts, but I really already understood the general concepts. I didn't have any issues with those. I know, for example, that fossil fuels are bad in general, and that nuclear energy is kind of cool in theory, but also potentially very dangerous, and that solar energy is fantastic and we need to invest more in that. Like, I already knew the very, very basics of it, but I didn't feel like he taught me much new. I felt like a lot of the specifics just went completely over my head, and I don't know, I was disappointed. Then I read The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh. I buddy read this with Abby MacReads. This is the sequel to The Wrath and the Dawn. It's an Arabian Nights retelling, and I thought that would potentially be very interesting, but I only thought the first book was kind of mediocre. This I didn't like at all. It felt full of plot holes, very convoluted. It felt like everything was anticlimactic, like things that were built up throughout the entirety of the first book were just solved in a page or 2 in this one, and then never brought up again, and I really didn't like that. I think Abby also gave it 2 stars and wasn't too taken with it either. So I think this was kind of a wash for both of us. The first book was better, but this was just disappointing overall. I think if you're on the fence about reading the sequel, just don't bother because it didn't do much for me. And much like the first one, it was also very forgettable. I don't actually remember too much about this book, which was disappointing because I thought it sounded like a very interesting premise. Then I read Freedom by J.C. Dugard. I was disappointed by this book as well. I gave it 2 stars. This is J.C. Dugard's second memoir. If you don't know who J.C. Dugard is, she was kidnapped as, I think, an 11-year-old and held in captivity for 18 years until she eventually escaped with her 2 teenage daughters. Her first book was specifically about her captivity. It was called A Stolen Life. I reviewed it a few months back and gave it 4 stars. I thought that was really moving, very powerful. This book, not so much. It didn't really feel like it did anything. It had any purpose. It was just a series of vignettes about her life and her first, basically. All the new things she was able to do with her freedom that she hadn't been able to do before. And I really wanted to love it for that. I really wanted this book to be as empowering as the first one was and to really touch me, but it didn't. This is going to sound mean, but it kind of felt like a school kid's What I Did Over the Summer essay, or a bunch of those essays bound up in one book. And I was just very disappointed, very bored. It took me several weeks to read, but I did it in just 2 sittings, mostly because the second time I read it, I just sat down and forced myself to get through the entire book, but I really couldn't see myself recommending this one. It just didn't do anything for me. Then I listened to Where Am I Now by Mara Wilson. This is another memoir. Mara Wilson was a child actress in the 90s. She was most famous for playing Matilda in the Matilda movie. I didn't really go into this book expecting anything at all. I'm not really a Mara Wilson fan. I've seen Matilda, but that's the only thing of hers I've ever seen, and I did like it, but it's never been like a favorite of mine. However, this book was really good. I gave it 4 stars, and there was a brief moment where I considered giving it 5. It was really insightful and really interesting, and one of those books where it felt like she wrote it because she had something to say rather than because she wanted to write another celebrity memoir. It's a collection of essays that tackle different points of her life and different issues, and it was all very interesting. Even for someone like me who really didn't know anything about her life and wasn't particularly interested in her specifically. It was just well done. She discussed what it was like to be a child actor. She discussed what it was like to go through puberty on a national stage and how it felt when she wasn't as pretty as a teenager as she was cute when she was a child. and she discussed her sexuality and coming to terms with that as a child actor who was seen with a certain eye of innocence, and it was just really interesting. Like, I would highly recommend. It did drag in a few points, which was kind of what knocked it down to 4 stars for me, but it was so worthwhile, and I'd highly recommend this book, even if, like me, you aren't the biggest Mara Wilson fan. If you just like memoirs like that, it was a really good memoir. Then I read A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. This was also for the rereadathon, to reread a book that was set in a different country or culture. I gave this 4 stars. This tells the story of 2 Afghani women from different generations, whose lives kind of intertwine. I did find it really interesting in the story overall, and I did like learning more about Afghanistan. However, it felt like the characters were more ideas of people rather than actual individuals, and that was a little bit lacking for me. And it also felt like it aired on the side of too much tragedy. Like, he kept throwing in more tragedy rather than developing the tragedy that he had. And it's not that I'm against reading sad books, because it's a war-torn country. I expect a great many tragic things to happen. But it didn't feel like they were developed well enough. And when there are just many tragic events, none of which are developed well enough, I kind of have an issue with that. And it doesn't feel as true to me or as real. And it doesn't impact me as much. So I did find it lacking for that, but the ending made me cry, so he did make me emotionally connect with the story, even if I had those issues with it, so I gave it 4 stars, and I do recommend this book. I do think it's worthwhile. And then I read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty, and I had a lot of issues with this book. This was my least favorite book of the month. I gave it 2 stars, and I did contemplate giving it 1 star just for how angry it made me. But there was interesting information in here. This is a nonfiction book about a woman who worked in a crematorium. I believe now she is a licensed mortician. And it's pretty much her experiences with death and death practices and what it means for our culture and what she thinks some good death practices are versus other more negative death practices. I wanted to like this. I thought it sounded interesting. I expected it to be more stories from her time in the crematorium, but what it turned out to be was just her thoughts on death and how we experience it in our culture, which, in her view, is very, very negative. I actually liked a fair amount of the information in this. I found it interesting. I liked learning about the whys behind death practices that we have today and certain rituals like embalming, but it felt like there wasn't very much of that. And most of this book was just her being really judgmental and condescending. At different points, she just outright mocked people who were clients of the mortuary, the crematorium where she worked. And because they were clients, that meant they had just lost someone, probably who was very close to them. At one point, she made fun of a dead infant's name. She said something along the lines of, it was sadder when the infants she was cremating had names, even when they were something terrible, like Caitlin spelled in a ridiculous way. Which rubbed me the wrong way and felt really judgmental and unnecessary, and like, who mocks a dead child's name? And then at another point, she made fun of the mother of a dead 9-year-old who tried to pay using the wrong credit card. That also made me cringe really hard, and those are only 2 examples. There were a great many examples in this book. It seemed like it was most of this book, her just being judgmental and condescending, and this book made me really dislike her as a person. I was really excited because people seem to really love this, but I did check the negative reviews on Goodreads, and I am not the only person who felt this way. So, I don't know, apparently it doesn't bother a lot of people who read this, but it really bothered me. And I definitely won't be looking into Caitlin Doughty anymore, because this made me cringe very hard, and I really, really disliked this book. And more than that, this book made me dislike her as a person, which most books don't make me do. I wouldn't recommend this, but I'd be interested to hear from people who've read this book to see why the stuff like that didn't bother you. Like, I would genuinely be interested in hearing that. And then I read This Lullaby by Sarah Dessen. This was a reread, and I actually listened to the audiobook. I didn't physically read this copy, but I've read this book so many times. I gave it 4 stars. This is a YA contemporary romance about a girl named Remy who doesn't believe in love. And then, of course, she meets a boy who's the complete opposite of her, and they have a little bit hate to love, a lot opposite attracts, romance, and I like it. I really like this book. It's lovely. It's kind of heartwarming. It's very cliche, but in a lovely way, and Remy goes through a lot of great character development, which I really enjoy reading about. I had some issues, especially with the beginning. The male love interest wouldn't take no for an answer and kept pursuing her, which made me very uncomfortable. but that did fade away very quickly, and they had like a lovely romance after that. But just in general, I highly recommend this book if you like YA contemporary romance, because I think this is a solid one. And the final book that I read this month was If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, which I gave 4 stars. I thought this was really fantastic. This is a 1970s book about a 19-year-old girl whose fiancé has been in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He is black and his imprisonment is racially motivated. It deals a lot with her and her realizing that she's pregnant and what she's going to do and trying to get him out of prison. And it's just a really powerful book. I think the word most people used in their reviews of this was passionate, and it really is passionate. The emotions in this book feel so raw and so powerful, and I can't recommend this enough. It was really, really wonderful to read. It's not something that I normally read. The writing style was very different to me, but it was so wonderful, and the voice in this book was so strong and really what made it stand out to me. I could hear Tish in my head, and it was so wonderful. I absolutely adored this, and I really do recommend reading this book. It was incredibly worthwhile and just really wonderful. This was recommended to me by Bookish, and I'm so glad that I eventually did get around to reading it. And that has been my very lengthy April wrap-up. Thank you guys for sticking around for this entire video, because it is quite long at this point. Let me know if you read any of these books down below and what you thought of them if you did. I'm always down to hear more from you guys and your opinions on the things I read, and I do enjoy disagreeing in the comments or like having discussions about the books, because that's why I'm on Booktube, honestly, and it's always interesting to hear differing thoughts or even the same thoughts. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.